Many Americans have long had a yen to get out on the open road with the wind in their face. When I say long, I mean long. Going back long before Peter Fonda hit the road on his laid-back chopper motorcycle in this iconic Easy Rider movie of 1969. Because, see, many folks mistakenly think that the term biker, implying freewheeling, high-speed, thrill-seeking, aggressive riders, was invented to describe motorcyclists, especially those that arose as biker gangs starting in the late 1940s, like the Hells Angels. And most folks have assumed biker babes are those females who hang out with this sort of biker, as you see in these illustrations from an earlier Peter Fonda movie from 1966, with a theme obviously based on the culture of the Hells Angels. Nah, freewheeling, high-speed, thrill-seeking, aggressive cycle riders and their babes go way back, over 70 years before Fonda, during the last decades of the Victorian era. But actually they weren't called bikers at the time. They were called Scorchers, and they rode at breakneck speeds without any motor on their bicycles, and indeed many of them were babes, like this decidedly unladylike young Victorian woman of 1900. Scorchers were fast, reckless bicycle riders, sort of the hot rodders of their day, says Lauren Shields, a respected bicycle photography and ephemera collector. Take a peek at her face. She has a charming, wicked smile, truly letting her photographer know of her independence. Perhaps the only thing missing is her tattoo. Sometimes Scorchers were painted in a positive light, such as in this cheery piano sheet music from 1897 titled The Scorcher. They were just portrayed as vivacious. Notice on the title page of the Scorcher song that the composer, Theodore Metz, was well known at the time for also having composed the tune for a well-known song from that period, There'll Be a Hot Time in the Old Town Tonight. The information on this cover sheet notes that the style of this piano piece is a gallop. A gallop is a type of lively Victorian-era dance in 2/4 time, a bit like the polka. Here's a brief little clip from a DVD set called How to Dance Through Time, demonstrating a Victorian-era couple dancing the gallop. Here's another cheery piece of piano sheet music composed in honor of the Scorcher, to which people danced a so-called two-step. And here's another example of the Scorcher being put in a positive light. This is a poster for a famous minstrel group that added performing song and dance and routines of daring and skill involving bicycles for some of its shows. But out in the real world, the term Scorcher usually had a much more negative implication, implying excess speed and recklessness. The general public was not so pleased with the antics of Scorchers like these fellows. Or this younger group of aggressive bikers that no doubt were a threat to pedestrians at times when they filled a street or sidewalk. And it wasn't just males who filled the role of Scorcher. This young woman in male attire was very likely able to hold her own in a dash down the street. as was this self-assured young woman jauntily posing on her bike. You can tell by her turned-down bicycle handlebars that she was used to hunching forward over her bike and barreling down the street at breakneck speed once she got going. Such reckless bikers weren't considered a minor issue in the mid and late 1890s. Articles about their escapades often made the newspapers across the nation. Opinion pieces like this one were typical across Europe and around the United States, from the East Coast to the Midwest to the Rocky Mountains. Scorching still rampant. The bicycle rider who speeds down the street leaving a trail of wounded and dying behind him is known as a scorcher. He seems to think he owns the street. People who happen to be out walking have no chance unless they too are riding bicycles. It is getting to be so that no one is safe who does not ride a bicycle. Even if the cyclist does not go fast, there is still the danger of his pedals hitting someone in their mad whirl round and round. It stands to reason that a big pedal jutting out from the side of a bicycle is going to hit something as it goes past, and someday it may be you that it hits, or your own mother. Is the game worth the candle? The public is entitled to a square deal. Let the scorchers go where they can really scorch. I'm kind of suspicious this may be the period in which the term speed demon was invented, as you can see from this cartoon of the period. But the police were soon hot on the trail of the scorchers. In 1894, Theodore Roosevelt became the police commissioner of New York City. The next year, he created a Scorcher Squad, a group of police equipped with their own bicycles and particularly tasked with chasing down and ticketing reckless bike riders, as well as performing such brave feats as catching up with and stopping carriages pulled by runaway horses. The New York Scorcher Squad made 1,366 arrests in their first year, and the idea caught on across the nation. Denver, Colorado, and Grand Forks, Minnesota began bicycle squads in the summer of 1896, also aimed at reining in scorchers. It's even reported that in Chicago, bicycle police used slingshots to hurl lead balls at the spokes of scorchers' bicycles. The impact would break the wheel's rim, and the cycle would come to a screeching halt. But I don't want to leave you with the impression that the world of bicycling in the 1890s was dominated by these scorchers. It wasn't. It was primarily full of average men and women, willing to ride sensibly and just take advantage of the conveniences the bicycle provided. Then again, I also don't want to leave you with the impression that the Victorian scorchers of the 1890s were the first folks in the 19th century you might consider forerunners of the wild and reckless mid-20th century bikers and their babes. There's some backstory to scorching you probably have never heard. In fact, it goes back even before the 1837 coronation of Queen Victoria, and thus partially predates the Victorian era, and goes back even before anyone thought to use the terms bicycle or bike. The very first two-wheeled contraption that we'd recognize as being an ancestor of the modern bicycle was invented in Germany in 1817 by a German man named Baron Karl von Drais. He dubbed it the Laufmaschine, which means running machine in English. The body and wheels of the first ones were made entirely of wood. Iron tires were later added, with the frame sometimes wrought iron. Dre's machine had no pedals, no brakes, no chain-driven gears, just a seat and a steering mechanism attached by a wooden frame to two small wooden wagon wheels, with a padded seat built low enough that the rider's feet totally touched the ground, because the only power moving it was the walking or running movement of the rider's legs and feet. It could get up to speeds of 4 or 5 miles an hour. Each machine had to be individually constructed to match the distance from seat to ground to the leg length of the owner. You may have seen modern riding gadgets that are constructed similarly. They are called balance bikes these days, and they're made for children up to about age 7 who are not quite ready to ride a real bicycle yet, so that they can safely learn balancing skills. Some of them are made almost all of wood and resemble Dre's vehicle quite a bit. But Dre's did not invent his gadget as a child's toy. The Laufmaschine was definitely created for adults, in particular males, and far from being safe, it was quite dangerous to use if the rider was not very skilled. And although it may look like these typical riders were having fun, Dre's had something entirely different in mind than just sport and recreation when he came up with the idea for his invention. It is said that he was inspired by the need to develop an alternate form of transportation that did not rely on the horse. And why might that have been? In April 1815, the Mount Tambora volcano, halfway around the world in Indonesia, erupted. You've likely heard of the catastrophic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in Italy in 79 AD that destroyed Pompeii and other area cities. And many people are aware of the devastating 1883 eruption of Mount Krakatoa near Java and Sumatra in Indonesia. Explosive sounds from that eruption were heard 2,000 miles away in Australia, and many tens of thousands died in the aftermath. But even though far fewer people seem to be aware of the Tambora eruption of 1815, it dwarfed both of those events. The Tambora eruption was the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The Mount Tambora volcano exploded with such force that huge clouds of gases, particularly sulfur dioxide, spewed miles high into the stratosphere and eventually spread over the globe, lingering for 3 years and more, and causing an extreme decrease in solar radiation reaching the Earth. As a result, in the year after the eruption, the Northern Hemisphere experienced what has long been known as the year without a summer. The worst effects of the cold were in New England, East Coast Canada, and Western Europe. Crops failed across those areas, leading to widespread devastation, disease, and starvation, especially among the poor. In the U.S., there was frost as far south as Virginia in August. Rapid, dramatic temperature swings were common, with temperatures sometimes reverting from normal or above normal summer temperatures as high as 95 degrees to near freezing within hours. Average summer temperatures fell by as much as 5 degrees Fahrenheit and more in some areas, and side effects from the disrupted atmosphere led to problems in Europe and Asia too. Monsoon seasons were disrupted. Unexpected extreme rainfall in many areas led to massive flooding, leading to famine and disease epidemics. And wild swings in weather occurred widely, including snow in summer in tropical Taiwan. One outcome from this was an extreme decrease in the number of horses in Europe, as many thousands died of starvation. Dre's realized that this sort of situation could be repeated in the future too, and thus that it would be very important, even for such simple military purposes as sending couriers, to develop an alternative method of transportation. He suggested his invention might serve that purpose. Then again, in order to get immediate sales, he needed to also emphasize the lighter side of the possibilities of the new vehicle. After introducing the machine in Germany, he sent a representative to promote the vehicle in France at an elegant gathering in a Paris park, where thousands of well-dressed upper-class folks paid an admission to come see a demonstration of this amazing new invention, cheering on competing riders just as if they were attending a horse race. This was followed by all sorts of print advertising that led to brisk sales for the new running vehicle. Soon enough, inventors and businessmen in other countries, particularly England, took an interest in the possibilities of Drese's machine. And with very lax patent laws across Europe, they were quickly cranking out rip-offs and selling them in their own countries. English inventor Dennis Johnson designed his own running vehicle based on Drese's basic idea, making improvements on Drese's machine, including a lighter frame of wrought iron, which allowed his vehicle to go between 9 and 10 miles an hour. Johnson found a ready market for his version in British high society. The novel vehicles were particularly popular among that class of status-seeking, style-conscious men of leisure known as dandies. You know, just like Yankee Doodle Dandy. And thus the vehicles earned the nickname dandy horses, sometimes also referred to as hobby horses. In order to keep his customers happy, Johnson even opened indoor riding schools where new owners could learn to balance on their pseudo horses. In May 1819, he even introduced a dropped frame version for ladies to accommodate their long skirts. At the height of their short couple of years of widespread popularity, dandy horses and the rich folks who bought them became fodder for satirical cartoons and writing in England. This cartoonist showed dandies inspecting a dandy horse for possible purchase as if it were a real horse. And whole series of satirical cards for sale as collectibles, illustrated in full color and looking quite like modern Mad Magazine cartoons, lampooned the whole dandy horse scene. In this series, they're referred to as hobby horses. The dandy horses were quite uncomfortable and inefficient to ride on bumpy roads that had carriage ruts in them, so riders often stuck to riding on smooth walking pathways in parks, and eventually trying to ride on the streets in cities and towns. Well, not even on the streets, which often also had wagon ruts. The entitled dandies wanted the right to ride on the smoother sidewalks, which put them in immediate conflict with pedestrians. With no brakes and poor steering, and often reckless drivers, this was often a recipe for disaster. And thus, within 3 short years, by 1820, the dandy horse craze came to a screeching halt. All over the world, local cities and towns enacted laws prohibiting their use. Here's a short video clip of silent film legend Buster Keaton riding a dandy horse in a short, humorous scene from his 1923 movie titled Our Hospitality, which had a plot set in the early 1800s. This will give you a little bit of a feel for what it would have been like to be part of the biker scene during the short life of the dandy horse fad. As you can see from this cartoon, by the end of their brief time in the limelight, dandy horses and their enthusiasts were relegated by many folks to just being the butt end of crude jokes. With the demise of the dandy horse, enthusiasm by inventors to create another two-wheeled vehicle that would require a balancing act by every rider waned too. Inventors still wanted to find a way to be the first to cash in on introducing a really practical human-powered vehicle, but instead of aiming at a new kind of two-wheeled bicycle, inventors for the next 50 years focused on the development of more stable three-wheeled tricycles and four-wheeled quadricycles, which were built for comfort and convenience for both men and women instead of speed. For example, this type of tricycle, introduced in the early 1850s, was fitted with a separate treadle for each foot, like the treadles used for old-time sewing machines, that the rider pumped up and down to get the wheels going. Steering was accomplished with a single long lever called a tiller, just like the tiller used to guide a rudder on a boat. And various models of four-wheeled quadricycles were developed during the same era, most working much like the tricycles with foot treadles and steering tillers. The quadricycles were particularly heavy, 100 pounds or more, and thus quite difficult for a single person to propel with treadling. So there were models that provided seating for two or more pedalers. In 1858, the quadricycle got an advertising boost in England when the Sawyer Cycle Company presented Queen Victoria's husband, Albert, Prince of Wales, with his own vehicle. But all of these human-powered vehicles had major drawbacks, particularly in an era with few smooth streets and roads to travel on. Clear up into the 1860s, they were primarily novelty items, purchased and used by the rich for occasional entertainment and for showing off to other rich people. And then in the late 1860s, inventors in France came up with the idea of adding cranking pedals to the front wheel of a dandy horse. And the race was on again to develop a practical, two-wheeled balancing vehicle that could be mass-produced for wide sales. These were quickly dubbed Velocipedes, based on a French word meaning swift foot. And suddenly lots of people were off to the races again. These Velocipedes were constructed with an iron frame with wooden wheels, usually wrapped with a band of iron as a sort of tire. Although formerly called Velocipedes, they quickly earned a not quite as nice nickname that was used widely, bone shakers. The invention of the inflated rubber bicycle tire in 1888 would provide a drastically more comfortable ride. But these early forerunners riding on iron rims jarred the rider with every bump in the usually very bumpy roads. Very soon, inventors caught on that making the wheels larger than they had been on the dandy horse would allow the Velocipede to travel farther and faster on each rotation of the pedals. And the larger tires provided at least a partially less jarring ride, so it was a win-win situation. Soon, a wide variety of these bone shakers, like this one from 1869, were being manufactured around Europe. They quickly made their way across the Atlantic to the United States, with U.S. manufacturers coming up with their own versions. The fad in the U.S. grew exponentially almost overnight. By early 1869, there were even Velocipede Schools springing up in cities like New York and Chicago. There, new Velocipede owners could go to practice riding indoors instead of making fools of themselves falling off their bone shakers on the city streets while they tried to learn to balance. Here's a poster advertising the details of the grand opening scheduled for April 5th, 1869, of one of the most famous of these schools, given the grandiloquent name of Gymnocyclidian. It was located at the corner of Broadway and 28th Street in New York City. You might say it was similar to the large indoor roller skating rinks that were wildly popular in the U.S. in the 1940s and 50s. It covered 8,000 square feet, had seating for 1,500 spectators who would come to watch special races and demonstrations of skill and tricks held regularly. There would be refreshments available. And instead of the later type of roller skating rink organ playing music to skate by, they actually had a full orchestra that played background music, both for special events and for people just riding velocipedes for recreation. The Gymnocyclidian was to be open from 7 a.m. to midnight every day, although I would suppose they likely closed on Sunday. Visitors could bring their own velocipedes, or they could rent one. For $15 a month, you could get a 1-hour lesson every day, and you could pay $10 for 40 tickets that would each allow you to ride for 1/2 hour in evenings. Daytime riding was available at a penny a minute. And a wide variety of the latest Velocipede models by various manufacturers would be for sale on the premises, with prices ranging from $65 to $150. An average weekly salary for a foreman in a factory in 1870 in New York was about $60 a month. So buying a velocipede and hanging out at the Gymnocyclidian was obviously not a recreational opportunity available to those in the lower classes in New York at the time. For those who could afford to indulge in the new fad, learning to ride one of the newfangled machines was not easy, as you can see from this satirical look at one such indoor riding academy. It was exciting to think how fast you could go on one, but that didn't do any good if you couldn't stay on it for more than a few seconds before falling off. But as more and more people learned to ride, there was also a rising concern that pretty soon most people would be able to ride them, and the prices would likely come down low enough for more people to afford them. And then what might happen to turn society upside down? Here's one view in an almost Mad Magazine-style cartoon that appeared in Harper's Magazine in 1869. The Velocipede Mania, What It May Come To. It took me a minute of looking closely at the pic before I noticed the details of the buildings in the back. A livery stable, closed because no one needed to rent horses or carriages anymore. And a meat market selling horse meat, since no one needed horses anymore. And if you look closely on the left, you will see that a woman is riding in a wagon pulled by another woman pedaling a 4-wheel velocipede. To get a feel for how much excitement was stirred across the land by the new contraptions, let's time travel back to 1868 in Charleston, South Carolina, and listen in to the hubbub through the pages of the local newspapers, as seen in a recent article from the website of the Charleston County Public Library titled The Velocipede Invasion of 1869. Beginning in the autumn of 1868, Charleston's principal newspapers, the Daily Courier and the Daily News, started printing brief news items about the appearances of bicycles on the streets of other American cities. Local readers may not have seen one of the strange machines yet, but they were certainly aware of its rapidly increasing popularity. In early December, the Charleston Daily News noted that New York, Boston, Baltimore, and Washington have velocipedes flying about their streets, and asked, who will be the first to introduce them into Charleston? A few weeks later, the local press noted that New Orleans had a velocipede, and a woman in Davenport, Iowa, was seen riding a velocipede on stage while wearing a bicycular garment. Across the Northeast and Midwest, a number of carriage makers quickly retooled their shops and began producing velocipede wheels and frames to satisfy increasing demand. The Charleston Daily News reported that a factory in Cincinnati was rolling out 1,600 velocipedes each week, and selling them for $35 apiece. By January of 1869, there were approximately 250 velocipedes in use in New York City, and the numbers were rising exponentially. The demand for them is so great in Gotham, said the Charleston Daily News, that the manufacturers have more orders on hand than they can fill in 2 months. In early February, the local Charleston press once again asked, "Why don't some enterprising person introduce the Velocipede here?" And then it happened. Some enterprising person did introduce the Velocipede to the residents of Charleston. Here's how the Charleston Library Story described the grand day. On the afternoon of Sunday, February 14, 1869, a lone rider appeared on King Street near the corner of Spring Street, pedaling southward on a homemade velocipede. The rider's name was Henry Duke, a local tinsmith and inventor who had built the machine in conjunction with Daniel B. Hazelton, a local machinist and agent for a sewing machine company. Mr. Duke's first ride down King Street attracted a considerable amount of attention and seemed to stop all business in the city's retail corridor. Mr. Duke was followed by a great crowd of men and boys, black and white, and people indoors who heard he was coming rushed to the windows to get a peep at the wonderful horse substitute. The paper quoted some of the curious citizens. "What's it? Where's it? Who's got it? Where did it come from? Have you seen it? There it goes! Whoop don't it fly! Break he neck directly. The devil in that same thing." For the next 5 months, the papers mentioned velocipedes nearly every single day, including this ominous comment that showed up in one article. Personal gossip. Miss Susan B. Anthony is in favor of women riding astride on velocipedes. Daily News, 6 March, 1869. Anthony and her women's suffrage activities were regularly in the news in 1869, and you might imagine many males, both Democrat and Republican, were very hostile to her influence in the post-Civil War U.S., including her opinion on what were appropriate activities for women. Enthusiasm for the growing fad hit a high pitch on February 25th when newspaper ads announced that the famous Hanson Brothers acrobatic show was coming to Charleston. The Hanlons were a fabulously popular acrobatic troupe that had wowed circus-style audiences all over the U.S. and Europe for the past 20 years. During their long career from the 1840s to the 1940s, the original brothers, and then their children and grandchildren, were the originators of many features of later circus acrobatic acts, such as the aerial safety net. In 1868, they had jumped on the opportunity to include trick velocipede riding to their show, using their own displays of skill and daring to attract buyers for a line of velocipedes that they promoted. And indeed, their 6-day run of shows in Charleston greatly increased the popular view of velocipedes. From March through early June, as the Velocipede Fad gained steam in Charleston, lots of folks were predicting the same sort of unending growth of the percentage of the population that might end up flooding the streets and sidewalks with the horsey substitutes that concerned citizens in cities all around America worried about. The reality, though, was much less imposing. As in many other cities and towns, the primary people buying and riding the iron and wood beasts were wealthy young men with lots of free time on their hands. The vehicles were not being snapped up by the average citizen who might view them as daily transportation to jobs and such. "1869 was only 4 years after the end of the Civil War. The city of Charleston had been devastated by the war and left much in ruins by 1865. The community certainly didn't make the creation of smooth streets for cyclists a top priority in restoration efforts. Velocipedes were much too bulky and their ride on anything other than rare, smooth surface roads far too uncomfortable to have wide appeal pretty much anywhere in the land, much less Charleston, South Carolina. Thus, they ended up a novelty item enjoyed mostly by strong young men from wealthy families interested in fun and speed. By early June, these joyriders were clogging the narrow sidewalks of the city, regularly running into pedestrians and making a terrible nuisance of themselves. The local police put in place regulations to keep them off the sidewalks. Many of Charleston's streets at the time were constructed of materials like crushed seashells, totally unsuitable for velocipede riding. That left just a few plank road sections of certain streets as gathering spots for bikers. Both white and African American young men had formed some bike clubs in the intervening months. During the daytime, white youths gathered in the plank road areas for socializing and racing, and after sundown, the African American cyclists used the same area for their activities. But the novelty of the velocipede and interest in being involved in the fad began dissipating by late June, not just in Charleston, but all over the U.S. as well as in Europe. And thus the Charleston Daily News announced succinctly in its pages on June 26, 1869, "The Velocipede Mania is subsiding in our city as it is everywhere else." During July, references in newspaper articles to velocipede activity steadily diminished, pretty much down to silence, and the fickle public turned almost immediately to a new fad. Yes, the public was ready for a new national pastime, and that was the game of baseball. It had been around for a few decades, featuring amateur teams by then, but it exploded into widespread popularity right after the Civil War. And in 1869, just as the Velocipede Mania was waning, the Cincinnati team, who wore red stockings, became the first ball club to go professional. By the end of the year, 11 more teams declared themselves professional, and leagues began forming. Charleston didn't have a professional team, but enthusiasts had formed the first amateur baseball club in 1866, and soon there were several Charleston clubs, both white and African American. So as the Velocipede Fad waned, the Charleston papers had begun including an increasing number of stories about local, regional, and national baseball. Yes, just like the dandy horse before it, the velocipede had an extremely short time as a fad. By the end of 1869, all the hoopla that led to the opening of the Gymnocyclidium and velocipede academies and riding rinks across the land had almost disappeared, and most of the facilities had closed. And across the world, pedestrians and police raised the same types of complaints about the velocipede bone shakers that had led to the demise of the dandy horse. The result was the same. Interest in owning and riding bone shakers died out, except among a relatively few die-hard speed demons who found fewer and fewer places available to indulge their hobby. With the effects of the eruption of Mount Tambora faded to a dim memory after 60 years, and climate back to normal across the northern hemisphere, there was no longer any worry about a shortage of horses, as you can see from this Currier and Ives print from 1875 showing the horse traffic on Broadway in New York City. And yet, as we saw in the beginning of this video, by 20 or so years after the bone shaker velocipede craze of the late 1860s, in the early 1890s, something had happened that brought the idea of riding two-wheel steel steeds back to great popularity in the U.S. and Europe and around the world. That time around, there were still speed demons, of course. They were mocked in satirical publications of the 1890s, just like the dandy horse riders had been mocked 75 years earlier. The two main satirical American magazines of the 1890s, obvious forerunners of Mad Magazine, often had covers and internal illustrations that incorporated the popularity of bicycle riding, such as the Puck magazine July 1897 issue on the left and the Judge magazine May 1897 issue on the right. Sometimes they showed bicycling in a positive light, but both didn't hesitate to scorchingly satirize the Scorchers of the time. Here, the September 1893 issue of Judge portrays a Scorcher as a unrestrained demon of the wheel, a gigantic Godzilla-like monster wreaking havoc on the countryside with his reckless speeding. And the July 1897 issue of Puck was even more sarcastically scathing, portraying a special kind of hell where Scorchers would be gleefully harassed by minions of the devil for their reckless transgressions with suitable torments forever. But no longer was the riding public characterized in general by such reckless cyclists. Respectable men and women of all ages and walks of life had begun using bicycles responsibly for recreation, social activities, and transportation needs. So what happened? How did we get from this crude, dangerous, miserable bone shaker in 1869 that mostly adventurous thrill seekers wanted to ride to this safe and fashionable method of transportation less than 30 years later? You might assume the next step after the bone shaker was the invention of the bike chain and gears and pneumatic tires on two wheels of the same size that you see on the 1890s bikes, making them look very much like modern bikes. Your assumption would be wrong. In the next episode of this series on Victorians Gone Wild, we'll start with the very next incarnation of a two-wheeled personal transportation device that came after the bone-shaking Velocipede. In fact, this device is the very first vehicle that was actually dubbed at the time of its introduction to the public specifically as a bicycle. Stay tuned for really big time bicycling.